Good afternoon, and welcome to the UCLA Department of History Why History Matters series. I am Carla Pestana, Chair of the History Department, and I am honored to welcome the alumni friends and our community partners to the department's final Why History Matters event of the academic year. Thank you all for spending some time with us to learn from our experts during these tumultuous times. Why History Matters is a series that brings together scholars and community leaders to discuss important issues in their historical and contemporary contexts. And the department is proud to be at the forefront of our most important conversations about the state of the world today. Since February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the world's attention has been drawn to what many observers see as an assault on democracy. As our gaze has been riveted on the events in Eastern Europe, today's events suggest that we take a step back and consider the larger context. In particular, how our understandings of actions taken by Russia and China are affected by ideas dating back at least to the Cold War. Today's Why History Matters discussion on China, Russia, and the US enduring legacies of the Cold War will contextualize the events of today by looking to our past. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, our moderator, Associate Professor Katherine Marino of the History Department, whose research includes human rights and US empire, among other interests, and who will lead our discussion today. Katherine.
Thank you so much, Carla. I am really looking forward to talking with our three wonderful panelists today. I'm delighted to introduce them. Jared McBride is an assistant adjunct professor in the history department at UCLA who specializes in the regions of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the 20th century, and whose research interests include nationalist movements, the Holocaust, interethnic conflict, and war crimes prosecution. His work has been published widely in leading journals and numerous public platforms, and he is currently completing a book manuscript on local perpetrators and interethnic violence in Nazi-occupied Western Ukraine. Our next presenter, or panelist rather, is Joyce Segal. He is the chief curator and director of programming at the Wende Museum in Culver City here in Los Angeles. His exhibitions and publications focus on Cold War cultural history and on art and politics since the 20th century. And last but not least, we're joined by Judy Tzu-Chun Wu, who is professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, where she is also director of the Humanities Center. She is the co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and the author of a number of books, including most recently, just published last week, Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takemoto Mink, First Woman of Color in Congress. And this book is a collaboration with political scientist Gwendolyn Mink. Thank you to the three of you for joining me in this conversation today. Just to start off, I wondered if you could each, given your own areas of expertise, tell us what you would like people to know about the Cold War. And also, if it's relevant, to talk about how the Cold War has shaped your own life and biography. And maybe we could start just with alphabetical order, start with Jared.
Thanks for having me. In terms of my own biography, I wouldn't necessarily, perhaps I'm a little younger than some of my panelists. I don't know know how much the Cold War has affected my own biography growing up in New Jersey in the 1980s. I will say that my first trip to Russia was in 2001. When there was a newly elected president at the time. So I guess my entire academic career and engagement with this country and region has seen one ruler. Or maybe two rulers, if we're going to count the other president. And I would say certainly my academic career sort of has taken place in sort of the aftershocks of the Cold War. And so I'll get to that in some of the comments today in the ways in which the Cold War sort of affected my own research capabilities and experience in the region. So I'll certainly bring that into the conversation. In terms of what to know about the Cold War and what's important about it today, given the current events in Eastern Europe, as a historian, I think it's important to keep in mind that while in one sense past is prologue, to use a famous quote, the past is also not a mirror for the present or a crystal ball. Over the past 2 months, as the world has tried to make sense of and explain what has happened in Ukraine. There has always been tempting desire to see the current events through the lens of the endlessly complex and multifaceted geopolitical event that spanned decades, known as the Cold War. While elements of the Cold War can certainly help inform our understanding of the present, and we'll certainly discuss some of those today, I think consistently falling back on often well-tread and often dated ways of seeing Russia and Eastern Europe more broadly is not doing anyone any favors. The most obvious point to make as a historian is that the deeper roots and historical context of the conflict go far beyond this maybe perhaps 1947 borderline, both in terms of the Russia-Ukraine relationship, as well as Russia's relationship with the West. The Cold War can also serve as a distraction for a more robust understanding of the 20th century or earlier. But perhaps I think the most maybe troubling aspect of this shortcut is that it often elides a 30-year window between the end of the Cold War and the present situation which we find ourselves today. By collapsing this 30-year time period into almost an afterthought, we miss a great deal of questions about the United States' own agency in the current events, as well as potential paths not taken on both sides. I think when we can find a lot worth thinking about in terms of these 3 decades, in terms of US, Russia, and Ukraine engagement, questions about NATO, a transition to a market economy, as well as a host of other issues. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Joyce, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, sure. Also, thank you very much for having me here. And Jared, you brought up so many aspects that are quite interesting, and I think we will be discussing later during this program. First of all, how I got involved. Actually, I was living, I am from Amsterdam originally, but I was living in Berlin for 2 years, writing my PhD on art debates during the First World War. And that was the period 1991 to 93. And I lived in Prenzlauer Berg, which was one of the then very artistic quarters of East Berlin. It's now heavily gentrified. And my daily contacts with people living there really intrigued me, not only about the Cold War history of Germany and Berlin, but also the public debates that followed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how the Cold War history was interpreted not only by historians, but also in the press and in the public debate in very contested and controversial ways. That made me decide I am originally an art historian to move to history. I became a history assistant professor at Utrecht University, and Utrecht University has an exchange program with UCLA, where I ended up guest teaching. And then one of my students actually alerted me to the existence of the Wende Museum in Culver City, where I met with the founder and director, and we became friends, and that brought me this job as chief curator of the museum. So what I think is really important for me to realize about Cold War history is that it is not just a story of ideological borders and divisions, but also very much a story of connections. And some of these connections are official, for instance, the exchange exhibitions, cultural context, scientific context, but many of them were also unofficial. Just thinking of, for instance, how the hippie movement in San Francisco was picked up in Leningrad and Moscow with great enthusiasm, how tourism both ways impacted the daily lives of people. And I think it's very important to realize that whatever the political structure or context, people are always making sense of their lives, whether it is in the East or the West or the global South. And that also makes for very strong connections, I think, just on a human basis.
Thank you. And Judy.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to engage in the conversation. I do feel like my life has been defined by the Cold War. My parents left China in the 40s because of the Civil War. They landed in the Republic of China in Taiwan, and that's where I was born. And I came to the United States in the mid-70s. And my father sort of lost contact with his family who remained on mainland China. And they might have had some correspondence, but there was very much a distance between them. And he was not able to return until after normalization, until many decades later. It's not something I hadn't thought about so much, but it really struck me as I was thinking about this question. I did want to talk about how the Cold War, how I understand the Cold War in relation to my field, which is Asian American history, US women's history, and also increasingly I've been thinking about the Pacific world and Pacific Islands, and Pacific Islander studies. And so I wanted to raise 5 broad topics. One is the way in which Asia is often the exception to the Cold War. So if you think about the definition of the Cold War, it's about this ongoing conflict between the East and the West, but short of open warfare. But if you think about the most prominent wars that took place during the Cold War, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, those were active wars, they were hot wars. And that the political division that exists in Asia has not ended. So you think about the ending of the Cold War, maybe we'll follow the Berlin Wall, maybe because of the changes that were in the Soviet Union, but there's still a North and South Korea, there's still a People's Republic of China and Republic of China. So I think that's a really important insight to consider if we think about foregrounding a particular region, how the conception of the Cold War and the chronology of the war needs to be questioned. I think a second major point I want to emphasize, and it's not just something that's a phenomenon of the Cold War, but it's really a phenomenon of war more broadly, are the ways in which war generates racialization in the United States. So people of Asian ancestry, when there's international conflicts with Asia, there's certain repercussions about the ways in which they are treated, their civil rights. So perhaps the most egregious example are incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, because US-Japan conflict. But as the United States launches into these conflicts during the Cold War, there's both the good Asians and the bad Asians. And given racialization, it's often very difficult for non-Asian people to recognize those differences. And so there's a wholesale demonization of these populations. And again, it's not necessarily that's something that's connected to the Cold War. We see that more recently with COVID-19 and the ways in which China is blamed, people of Asian ancestry are blamed for this global pandemic. I think a third aspect that I want to foreground is the ongoingness of war. And this is something that I think critical refugee studies as a field is really trying to emphasize, that wars don't end just because of international agreements. They don't end because the fighting stops, but there's ongoing cultural, emotional, mental impacts of war. Viet Nguyen has won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel, The Sympathizer, but he also has a really wonderful nonfiction book called Wars Never End. And he talks about the ways in which you fight wars on the battlefield, but you also fight wars on the ongoing way in terms of popular representation, popular memory. A fourth aspect I want to emphasize are the ways in which the Pacific region really serves as a staging ground and a militarized site for war. And again, this goes back beyond the Cold War. So I think about the rise of the United States as a global power in the late 19th century, the ways in which the US-Spanish War launched the US-Philippine War, and then also this broader kind of transportation route, militarized route across the Pacific. Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, these are all way stations for the US military, and they become crucial sites of deployment during the Cold War. And they also constitute crucial sites of military testing. So nuclear testing, conventional testing, chemical testing. This is the place where the United States makes war. And then finally, I do want to emphasize the importance of having a people's history of the Cold War. So thinking about those who were opposing their countries and the escalation of conflict, the ways in which they're trying to seek peace, or the ways in which they're advocating for anti-imperialist politics. And so those are the 5 aspects that I think about when I consider how the Cold War resonates with the fields of my interest.
Thank you so much for those 5 themes that are so thought-provoking, and for your own biography, which is also fascinating. All of you have sort of started to touch on this question, but I wanted to ask if there are ways in which you see the politics of the Cold War being played out in what's unfolding today, in terms of Russia and Ukraine and the war, in terms of China, in terms of US international relations with these places, global alignments or realignments, or are there ways in which you would argue what's happening today needs to be viewed as distinct from events in the Cold War. And feel free to jump in and answer if you'd like to lead us in this in response.
I'm happy to start, and then we'll see where it leads us. So I think there are continuities and discontinuities. Of course, it's clear that Putin is constantly referring to at least one moment during Cold War history, or actually just before Cold War history, the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. But I think it's also important to realize that what he is really trying to achieve, I think, is not so much a return to the Soviet Union, but more a return to the grandeur of the Russian Empire. And you can see that the argumentations he uses are much more cultural in many instances than political. Also, the way he describes the West is not so much like it was common during the Cold War period, during the Soviet Union, that the West is capitalist and imperialist and racist, etc. He argues much more that Western civilization is a civilization in decay, that it is decadent, that it is degenerate. And I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind, that also has geopolitical implications. For instance, with the relations between Russia and African countries, where this element of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism always used to be very important, but yeah, gets on a different meaning or a different accent at this point. Yeah.
I could maybe jump in there. So pick up, I had some answers that were charted out, but maybe I'll hop around instead. So I mean, maybe to pick up on just point about the civilizational discourse. And I think this is maybe a discontinuity and something that's important and worth bringing up now. And there's been some great pieces on this as of late. And this is a question of soft power. And so, in the ways in which Russia plans on using soft power to deal with its neighbors, as well as in terms of global outreach. And we saw a pivot around 2010, 2012 with various efforts by Putin and his government to make or to create some sort of meaningful ideological alternative to the West that was supposed to sort of help this transition, at least in their eyes, perhaps from a regional to a global power, although it's probably more likely from a kind of isolated country to a regional power. But I think what we've seen is, despite various attempts at propagating Russia as some sort of special civilization and some sort of answer to the West, this use of clunky constructs like Ruski Mir or Russian world and other ill-fated or illiberal visions of the world, many of these have fallen upon deaf ears in the near abroad as well as the abroad. So much so that many of these constructs have actually even been dropped by the Russian government and Putin himself in a lot of discourse. As of late, and they've fallen back on what I think are far less creative and meaningful tools, such as grievance and nostalgia. So in short, I think Russia has not a lot to offer to its neighbors. We've seen this in Ukraine as well as Europeans writ large, in the way that perhaps during the Soviet period or different parts of the Cold War, that communism as a belief system did offer something in terms of a meaningful understanding of the world, despite, of course, its amazing shortcomings in the Soviet experience, as well as in the violence of the system. And then with specific reference to Ukraine, the Russian ideological project here, even when it's targeting Russophone regions in Ukraine, it itself is simply just running on the fumes of history and the nostalgia of Soviet legacies. It's not offering anything new or meaningful. And so I think that that's a really important distinction to make when kind of making this comparison with the Cold War period.
I'm not a China specialist, but I did want to comment that the fears that the United States has expressed and other, I guess, Western nations about China's alignment in this international conflict, I think do fall along Cold War alignments. But I think those suspicions, again, go further back than 1949. They have longstanding kind of antagonism, suspicions about China as a global power, the economic potential of China. There's different periods of time in which China's been seen as particularly weak, and other times in which there's a great fear of China in terms of its strength. So I think there's some ebb and flow, but definitely I think some of the political discourse is following along the lines of Cold War divisions.
If I may briefly respond to something Jared said, which I think is very interesting, the idea of grievance and nostalgia. And Jared, I just want to ask you, what do you think of the concept of humiliation? Because in the 1990s, there were many reasons for Russia to feel humiliated. I guess we will speak about NATO expansion. One aspect is that in February 1990, George Shultz, Minister of State in the United States, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, and since then 14 new countries have been added to the east. Apart from possibly being seen as a threat, and that might be contested, it's definitely a humiliation. What do you think about that?
I would agree with you. Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of motivation or motivating factors of Russian orientation in the current war in Ukraine, as well as with engagement in the West. I mean, maybe specifically since 2014 in regards to the Ukrainian events. I think that is, I think that is certainly a contributing factor to the orientation and understanding of these events. I mean, I guess my point here is more speaking in terms of ideas that are exportable or sort of understandings of the world or understandings of history, that this is kind of fallen back more into sort of I guess a negative position than a positive one. And we'll, I guess in our conversation today, I'm interested to hear some of the other opinions and comments on sort of the cultural realm as well, which again, it's unclear what for instance Russia is offering its neighbors in terms of culture or other aspects in a positive sense, that is going to want to bring its neighbors closer to it rather than from the West or from Europe. And so
thank you. And yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the origins of the war in Ukraine and the way that the Cold War is connected, or in your points of view to that. But I did want to pick up on Judy's point about race and racism. And then, I mean, it seems like Joe's comments about civilizationalist discourse from Russia might connect in some ways. I'm curious about the ways in which you see nationalism, race or racism playing out. One of our listeners wrote in a comment connecting how contemporary Russian sort of discourse or from Putin is connected with a 21st century racist Christian identity movement, and wondered whether there's a connection to the sort of grievance politics that you're describing, or if you think there's something distinct in terms of connections with other sort of populist nationalism that's happening elsewhere around the world. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that. I can move on.
Sorry, I thought it was a question for Judy. So yeah, no, I agree, and I just want to bring up that I think the way of reasoning by Putin these cultural arguments are of course not exclusive to Russia. And one of the things that came to my mind as a comparison is the Samuel Huntington book, Clash of Civilizations, which is as rigid in its approach to the world as this group of different irreconcilable civilizations that are doomed to clash sooner or later. And actually, there's an interesting mirror, I think, in the fact that Huntington also sees Western civilization, at least in danger of being in decay. He tries to turn around that process. But yeah, sometimes it's interesting to see how people either from very opposing ideologies or from very different political backgrounds can come up with theories that are structurally so similar.
maybe to Catherine's question, maybe specifically with Russia and its view of Ukrainians, and this is something maybe we've already mentioned, but I mean, Putin is certainly tapping into legacies of the Soviet Union and the ways in which Ukrainians were a part of this larger Soviet family, and it's certainly tapping into larger imperial legacies of Russian rule over these territories. Now, I think the question of race is a quite complicated one, and there's not necessarily even a coherent or cogent sort of vision, I think, coming out of Putin or the Kremlin on this issue, right? Are the Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine actually, Russians that need to come back home to the family? Are they people who are actually different? Are all of Ukrainians our enemies? Which of the Ukrainians are our specific enemies? So there's been very confused rhetoric, and I think it's confused for good reasons, because I don't think they actually have a clear and cogent picture, and that's really shown in the way in which the war has been prosecuted and the ways in which they've treated Ukrainians when they've been there. A lot of, from the Ukrainian side, I think a lot of Ukrainians from their perspective would use this term race and say that they are sort of a different ethno-national group, and that this is a part of a racist Russian vision. But we could certainly also use terms, again, of a colonial relationship or an imperial relationship. I think also can function well here in the current context.
I'm going to answer from a slightly different angle. I think about the rise in anti-Asian hate that's occurred in this country and has been documented. It's been escalating during the pandemic, and it's continuing. So it's not necessarily decreasing, even though there's new political leadership. And again, it reflects the longstanding forms of racialization in this country that precede the Cold War, that become intensified during the Cold War and in hot wars. So I think about the ways in which Chinese people have been racialized in the United States. They were the first group targeted for immigration exclusion. So Chinese laborers in particular, and Chinese women. And they were also designated aliens ineligible for citizenship. So they were forever foreign based on legal processes and legal standards for naturalization. And these ideas outlive their kind of the legal status of the laws. I think about the most recent Olympics and the number of American athletes who are competing under other flags, and the uproar about these athletes potentially, competing for the enemy of the United States. So I think there's kind of long-standing understandings of which racial groups actually constitute being American, and those ideas get revived and fueled when there's times of international conflict.
Thank you so much. I wanted to pick back up on a point, or Joe's mentioning of NATO and the origins of the conflict in Ukraine, and wondered if any of you would like to talk about how significant the Cold War was to the origins of this conflict. The origins have obviously been very intensely debated. So I wondered what, from your perspective, is important when thinking about how and why the conflict started.
I'm happy to jump in here. And I guess this will probably echo maybe some of the early comments already, of saying that sort of isolating the Cold War, perhaps bracketing off, is not necessarily the best approach to understanding the conflict in the present, yet it's a very important part of it, and also trying to untangle some of these various threads. And so Putin's justifications for this war, I think, to many of us, have appeared almost equal parts erratic, disturbing, and historically inaccurate at times, have often veered from absurd accusations of Nazis running the government in Kiev to longer term disrespect from the West as reasons for the justifications. And perhaps the absence of any cogent articulation of what Russia actually wants in Ukraine, coupled with an ever-changing laundry list of grievances, I think is what's helped fuel intense speculation about the debate on this particular topic. And I would just simply lay out, maybe if this is useful or not for our conversation, I would just simply lay out some of the various layers of these explanations of trying to understand why this war happened, why we saw a full-scale invasion of this nature, and maybe sort of, and this is also, not necessarily, I'm not saying these are the reasons for it, but at least part of the debate that's been generated over the last couple months from scholars and many others. And so I sort of lay out sort of 5 points as to why, I'm sorry, 4 points, 5 points, why we think this has happened, and working from the particular to the more global, and I think Cold War will come into this for sure. So in terms of the particular, Russian anger at the political situation, or Putin's anger at the political situation in Ukraine, more specifically in the post-Soviet period, grounded first, I think, in the Orange Revolution of 2004 and 5, which was the sort of first blow to Russia's ability to dictate politics in Kiev. And then second, of course, by the Maidan Revolution of 2014, which saw the ouster of a pro-Russian leader. So the war certainly has its roots, I think, in these specific grievances about politics in Ukraine. Second, security in the near abroad, and Joe's already mentioned this, and we'll get more into this now, but Russia has seen NATO expansion since the 1990s as a potential threat to its own security. This issue has taken on more salience with regard to Ukraine, and specifically when the Bush administration laid out the potential pathway for Ukraine to join NATO beginning in 2008. And this has also taken off as an issue since 2014. The third point, and this is again now getting more global, Russia's standing in the world in the post-Cold War order. So grievance about Russia's place at the table on the world stage when it's come to global security or economic issues, and seeing Ukraine almost as a symptom of this treatment by the West refusing to abide by Moscow's wishes there. And as such, Putin has thought to make a stand here in Ukraine as a response to this sort of larger complaint. And this grievance also is perhaps rooted in the post-Cold War order, but I think you can see these feelings of dismissal back deep into the Soviet period. And then fourth, and kind of building on this last point, the personal as political. And here I think this is deeply tied to feelings of, this is deeply tied to the previous point in the way in which Russia's place in the global order in terms of recognition in respect is tied to the person of Putin. So often where Putin ends and Russia begins has often been hard to tell over the last few years in specific, but it's clear that Putin tends to see these geopolitics as personal. And his ability to see beyond these frames of personal offense has really probably hampered his decision making in recent years. And we often think there's maybe one point. We often see the success of the seizure of Crimea as this sort of well thought out strategy by Putin. But now we perhaps are beginning to reevaluate this and see this as also sort of an emotional response to the Maidan Revolution that did sort of happen to work out in the short term for Russia. And then finally, and we've already mentioned this as well, sort of longer term views of Russian views of Ukraine and Ukrainians, tapping into imperial and Soviet legacies that tend to negate Ukrainian identity, sovereignty, and autonomy in service of sort of more grandiose visions of Russian empire and importance. And I don't think it's any one of these particular things. I think it's likely to be multi-causal, and that these all sort of layers of explanations have likely sort of fed in to the roots of this particular war. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jared. Joyce and Judy, would either of you like to comment?
Yeah, maybe just following up on the last point. And Jared, thank you for those 5 points. I think that's a very clear overview of different aspects to be taken into consideration. That culture point, or the autonomy of Ukraine as manifested by the Orange Revolution first and then later the Maidan Revolution. I think it's striking that Putin actually criticizes Lenin for offering a certain amount of autonomy to the republics, including Ukraine, while he argues that Ukrainians and Russians are actually the same, that there is not a separate Ukrainian culture, it's all one. And then, of course, well, Jared already mentioned that this is all not very consistent, but I would argue that killing off the people of Ukraine is not the best way of proving your point here.
Thank you so much. Joe, since you brought up this, or you both brought up the question of sort of distinctive Russian or Ukrainian cultures, and I thought that could segue into another question about the sort of non-state politics of the Cold War, how the things like art, culture, even education were influenced by Cold War geopolitics. I'm thinking, Joe's, about your own extensive work in art and culture, Judy, your work on non-state actors, and then Jared, thinking about how things like educational institutions and questions of funding are influenced by the Cold War today, or the Cold War in the past and today. So open that up for whoever would like to respond to that. I guess the question is just thinking about both in the Cold War and today, how culture, art, education were influenced by these geopolitics.
I'm happy to start. So I think culture has played a very important role during the Cold War period in connecting, which I already, connecting people, which I already mentioned in the beginning, but it did so sometimes in a very paradoxical way. And if I can give one example, it's well known that the United States Information Agency and arguably also the CIA supported travel exhibitions of American modern art to Eastern Europe and to the Soviet Union with the aim, including abstract expressionist, really avant-garde modern art, with the aim of showcasing the free spirit of American culture, the liberalism of American culture, in the hope of influencing and impacting especially a younger generation across the Iron Curtain. And to a certain extent that actually worked. So it's well known that some younger Soviet artists were deeply influenced by those abstract expressionist works that interestingly were, by the way, also presented at the World Youth Festival in Moscow a few years earlier. But then paradoxically, conservative Americans, Republicans, including the FBI, tried to do everything to stop this exchange because they argued that abstract expressionist artists were actually communists. There was one famous case of a Republican, George Dondero, who claimed that abstract expressionism was an invention of the Soviet Union with the aim of disrupting American society. And one of his colleagues actually mentioned that the drip paintings by Jackson Pollock must be seen as decoded maps of the United States in preparation of a nuclear attack. So all these kinds of weird things happened where, again, you see that the extreme right wing in the United States had some parallels with Stalinist absolutism in the Soviet Union. So culture can be used in both ways. It can be a connector, but it can also be abused as a symbol of division.
It's really wonderful to hear, Joyce. I was thinking about two things. One, in my previous book that looked at anti-war activists and their international travels, I was really interested in thinking about how do people imagine internationalism, right? So Benedict Anderson talks about the nation as being imagined and that we don't know everybody, but we have this emotional connection, cultural connection, political connection. And so I was interested in people who were not buying the national patriotism, the national line of kind of Cold War division, but we're really thinking about the enemies of their country as potentially sympathetic individuals, people who they want to connect with. And I think the underground press and the circulation of imagery during that time period, of books, of films, artwork, that was so essential for fostering that imagined internationalism. And I think about the repetition of certain icons, images that appeared in Europe and United States and Africa and Asia, right? So that global circulation, I think, really allowed people to think differently about the world. I think the second thing I wanted to emphasize is that I just recently saw a really wonderful documentary called Beethoven in Beijing, and the ways in which the Philadelphia Philharmonic was trying to reach across Cold War divides to introduce Beethoven to musicians in different parts of China. The ways in which actually those initial outreach among musicians then fostered the international travels and training of musicians from China. And then now the ways in which an Asian global market in some ways is saving the music industry, the classical music industry. So I just thought that was really fascinating. And throughout different periods, there's different power dynamics. So it's hard to get away from the West as more enlightened interpretation. Like here we are bringing a great art that people in China no longer have access to, right? That kind of the West represents freedom and individualism and artistic expression. But then the turn to the more recent time, thinking about the ways in which Asian global capital basically can provide funding for the West. And that flips the switch in some ways, but not completely. So I wanted to just share those two aspects.
Thank you.
And if I could, yeah, I'll maybe pick up on some of the points about Russia. I mean, this idea of, well, in some ways, and this is perhaps I'm too young to, I'm a little too young to sort of miss this, but this idea of culture as this amazing battlefield during the Cold War, it's not something I've really experienced at all in my life. And maybe, and Joyce kind of brings up this point, the kind of potential threat, culture as a potential threat as well from Russia. And to put that into the current context, and I mean, and maybe I'm interested in your thoughts on this, or anyone's thoughts on this, but I mean, I think we probably all agree we're living in a time of, cultural hegemony from the West or from the United States. And this is, again, a kind of discontinuity. I don't think Russia offers any cultural threat to the West whatsoever at this point in time. I would say how many Americans under the age of 25 have ever seen a Russian movie, and having taught most of those Americans, I would say virtually none of them. And this also goes back to this question of soft power, of even what Russia is able to offer its neighbors or to Europeans in general. And when we turn to these questions of cultural production, this has not really been, at least to my mind, this hasn't been something that has brought people closer to the Russian orbit in recent years. And if anything, and we've seen this specifically under Putin and specifically over the last decade or so, a lot of the cultural production in Russia has often been turning inward, and again playing on nostalgia of a Russian and Soviet past that I don't think people watching the most recent blockbuster about Stalingrad or Leningrad or any other numerous events of the Second World War is really a useful propagandistic tool in any sort of positive or negative sense about bringing people closer to Russia. And so I just wanted to make that point about cultural production in the current moment, but I'm curious to hear if anyone has any other thoughts on it.
I'm interested in what you think about right, kind of Russia's presence at the Olympics, through athletics, or through like classical ballet or music. I mean, there's ways in which Russia can kind of claim this great tradition, both in terms of music, but also in terms of athletic prowess. But there's also a lot of controversy, right, about doping and all these things. So I'm kind of curious about what you thought about, what you're thinking about in terms of the most kind of recent controversies or efforts to cultivate international kind of favor, right, through these athletic or musical performances.
Oh, I guess the Olympics have not been very successful would be the short version of it, right? I mean, but that's really a good question, right? A really great point. I mean, thinking about Cold War legacies, like if anything, and especially maybe my generation, again, too young, but my parents or the boomer generation, I mean, what is the Olympics? What does that trigger in their minds? It triggers the fact that they see Russians or communists as cheaters, and they'll think about East German swimmers or the whatever Bulgarian team, right? In many ways, similar to the way we've seen, again, this horrific aggression in Ukraine, it sort of triggered certain versions or understandings of Russians that were likely ingrained during this Cold War period. And you're right. I mean, and that's a really great point about that being a potential place of outreach of Sochi, of the Olympics, of the World Cup, which I actually happened to be there for part of it. And these many ways could be positive moments of outreach, but they've also seemingly backfired in the ways in which others have as well. And of course, yes, the wonderful reservoir canon of Russian music and literature and film and everything else. I mean, that's always a reservoir they can go back to. But even in light of the current conflict and the violence in Ukraine, and we've seen a turning away from that too, and a lot of and perhaps this is happening and perhaps this will continue, but also a lot of reevaluation exploitation of elements of imperialism and violence, even in a lot of these great works, and especially treatment of Ukrainians. And so we could also perhaps keep in mind that that itself may backfire in the coming years if Russia's going to go back to the old, the usual tools in terms of cultural diplomacy. They may not have the same salience today. And I'm even this one thing I had learned, and I'm certainly not a poetry expert or a culture expert for that matter, but this very incredibly offensive poem that Joseph Brodsky, this the darling of the Cold War, this the wonderful poet who came to the West and wrote this deeply disturbing poem about Ukraine, dismissing them, and that even like little things like this that have kind of come to the surface now in this particular moment, I think are really interesting and worth noting.
And Brodsky wrote that poem long before the war in Ukraine, by the way, but it is as though you hear Putin speaking when you read this. Yeah. To your point about the younger generation in the United States not watching Russian films, I had this experience that during a course on Cold War culture at my home university, Utrecht University, I showed the film Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, which is one of my favorite films. And after the film finished, it was silent for a few moments. And then one of my students said, "Professor, do you hate us that much?" So there's a certain generational disconnect there, maybe. But I also wanted to bring up the point that I think it's quite remarkable how much critical art is being produced right now in Russia. And apparently, at least so far, the Putin government isn't that active in trying to contain it or censor it, unless it becomes very explicit, like with Pussy Riot or something like that. But generally speaking, the cultural and artistic climate in Russia still is pretty liberal. Although another thing that really changed now is that many museum people are speaking out against the war, and they are being disciplined, and that's not something you can easily do nowadays.
And that's a really great point. I mean, one, also point out that yes, there are plenty of Russians in Russia today who are against the war and are using art as a means to criticize that, for sure. And your point about there's still being, there's still an opening there, right? And even though we've seen this, spectacular closing of many aspects of Russian life in the past 2 months, or even over the last decade or so, but it's been uneven, right? And so we've seen the crackdown. You can't go on certain social media either, that's coming from the West, but also internally to Russia, the crackdown on information in certain sites. But it's certainly, again, go back to the Cold War, it's not the same situation. Access to information's flowing much more openly than before. There was this article a couple of days ago about the hundreds of thousands of VPNs that have been downloaded in Russia recently, so they can get access to information in Western culture. And also, to your point, we haven't seen a full crackdown yet, at least in that arena, the way we have in other arenas, NGOs, and and other issues or news information and such like that. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on, and also worth noting that there are Russian artists, of course, have left and gone abroad already as a part of fear of a crackdown, which is important to note.
That's really fascinating. I wondered, Joseph, if you had an example of an artist sort of intervention or protest that was compelling, just because I actually hadn't heard much about artists in Russia protesting for war.
Yeah, well, there are a few artists that are actually very explicit in their sometimes performances or public performances, and they tend to get arrested. By the way, I don't know if you heard, but a few days ago, actually people got arrested in Russia by holding up signs that were empty, just with no text or no image whatsoever, which I think is such an interesting example of what is projected onto those blank canvases. But I think, mainly speaking, many Russian artists are not directly political, but don't conform to any form of propaganda or state art, and just continue in their more autonomous or more psychologically informed basis of art production.
Thank you. Since we only have about 10 minutes left, I wanted to ask about sort of what you would like to close with and let people know. We've been inundated with information from journalists about a lot of what we've discussed today, the war in Ukraine, US-China relations, and other topics. And I wondered if what you think media conversations in recent weeks or months haven't addressed that's important to know, or if there's anything else from your understanding of Cold War history that you'd like to leave with us today. And Jared, maybe we could start with you. Is that?
Sorry. Well, if it's okay, maybe I would use just a couple of minutes. There was something maybe to add on one of the previous questions as well, and kind of tying in the Cold War. This sort of comment about this question about sort of funding and the ways in which we're kind of living with the legacies of the Cold War in the present. And I think one of the really interesting contradictions or that we find ourselves in the current moment is, and this is, you can see this in the academy and perhaps in governments as well. But we kind of find ourselves in a place where the sort of younger generation of scholars, some of us had been sort of in many ways the kind of final generation to get some of the remaining funds from various Cold War sources that we used to study, at least at the time, was designed to study our enemy and to get to know something about it, about them. And that in recent years, and specifically since the mid 2010s, we've actually seen a rollback of a lot of this funding, in specific to study Russia and Eastern Europe. This rollback happened before the events of 2014 in the Maidan, but it's important to keep in mind, despite those events, despite the beginning of a hot war conflict in Ukraine in 2014 and up until the present moment, that this is not a reinvigorated, at least funding from state sources to have any, to study and understand this region. And I think one of the most common questions that I've gotten over the years from colleagues and family members and strangers has often been that, well, if this is this, we find ourselves in this new Cold War-ish like situation with Russia, is there going to be a new investment when it comes to the academy, when it comes to training diplomats, when it comes to creating expertise to study this region? And I would have to, and I'd be curious really to hear what some of the my other co-panelists think, but I have not seen any evidence of that. And I think this has a lot to do with the way funding for expertise is done in general in terms of the U.S. government, not just with respect to this region, but more generally. And then, of course, just the political situation in our country at present. There doesn't seem to be any movement towards re-engaging financially or otherwise with these places, despite what now is, again, the worst war and refugee situations in Europe, including the Balkans, but since the end of the Second World War. And so this is, again, perhaps we're still on a different continuum here than we are simply going back to the Cold War period. We're in a post-Cold War continuum that is not going to see a kind of re-engagement with this region in terms of scholarship or expertise. But I'd be curious maybe if that's an okay question at this time.
Maybe I'll just say a couple things. One is that I just went to an event today at UCI for a new Global Asia Studies cluster. And I was thinking about the question of how the Cold War has shaped academia. And the formation of area studies, right, is a Cold War formation that as the United States aspired to become a global power, it provided funding for language training, culture training, historical studies to think about the regions of the world that the United States wanted to engage with politically. And so East Asia is one of those areas, although it has a longer history beyond the Cold War. The other field that I'm more invested in, I guess, is Asian American studies. And that was an anti-imperialist formation. So it was really trying to critique Cold War divides. It was trying to name US imperialism. It was trying to name US racism. And so it's interesting that these two areas emerged in response to the Cold War and the formation of third world kind of political formations. Global Asia, I think, is a way to sort of kind of bring those fields together, to think about globalization, to think about diaspora, to think about transnationalism. So I sort of welcome when we get there. I'm not sure we're right there yet, like a post-Cold War order that could shape our intellectual imaginaries, or at least think about kind of political and cultural phenomenon that's not beyond, that goes beyond just kind of nation state conflicts. So I'm kind of interested to see what's next. I think the other thing I want to point out is about refugee, the wars create refugees, and refugees, I'm interested in the field of critical refugee studies because it helps us name the political processes that we experience or that nations undergo when they name who's a legitimate refugee versus who's not. And those have been along Cold War lines, right? And along racial lines. But also that field is trying to humanize refugees so they're not just victims that need to be rescued or propagandistic, that they provide propagandistic value. Some people have pointed out how the United States lost the Vietnam War, but they won the Vietnam War in terms of the ways in which it's seen as welcoming refugees, right? And to really think about refugees themselves as human subjects, as subjects who have emotional experiences, full life experiences, worldviews that are really valuable and actually offer us new insights about nation states, about status of citizens. So I'll just maybe leave with those two insights.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe to follow up, and Judy, I think that's a great point about refugees and also the connections they make. I would like to add that, yeah, what do journalists leave behind? I think journalists have another aim than historians. They try to find facts and try to document what is happening, whereas historians try to make sense of it from a historical perspective, explain what is happening. And in the historical perspective, of course, you see another kind of contestation than in journalism, where it's all about what is true, what is fake, what is not true. In history, it's more about from what perspective can you make sense of what you see happening. And I sometimes think, again, to your point, what is missing, that this perspective is not always so conscious. So where do you yourself come from in your interpretation of the past? What are your basic starting points, your values from which you make sense of what you see happening? And yeah, wanted to make that point.
Thank you so much. This has been a really enlightening hour. Thank you so much to our panelists, Jared McBride, Joyce Segal, Judy Tzu-Chun Wu. Thank you to Lisa Mohan and Hillary Nodworny for organizing Why History Matters. And thank you so much to Carla Pestana, our chair and host of this series. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks, everybody.
Through.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.